In daily life, one thought follows most people almost everywhere. How do I make more money? If that thought keeps returning, it is not always because of greed. More often, it comes from fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear that if you pause, something will collapse. Fear that if you loosen your grip, whatever you barely manage to hold together will scatter. So people stop allowing themselves to rest. They stop allowing themselves to soften. Some even stop allowing themselves to be openly, lightly happy. In the end, they turn themselves into machines that are never permitted to power down. And yet for many people, money remains stubbornly difficult, not only because they lack skill, and not only because the timing is wrong, but because they misunderstood wealth from the beginning. We were taught to assume that money flows toward the most alert, the most tense, the most tightly controlled, the least willing to let go. But the deeper paradox is this: the more desperately you try to seize it, the easier it slips through your hands. Our era has glorified striving far too much. It has wrapped anxiety in the costume of ambition. We are told that wealth comes from sweat, discipline, precision, and a 24-hour state of vigilance. So people spend their lives chasing something that never quite lets itself be caught. On the surface, they are chasing safety. Underneath, they are being driven by fear of lack. Over time, that defensive posture begins to look intelligent, responsible, mature. But in reality, it cuts us off from a deeper cooperation with life. When a person lives for too long in internal alarm, sensitivity becomes dull. Judgment starts to warp. Even real opportunities, when they finally appear, may be rejected by the fear that gets there first. Relaxation, then, is not laziness. It is not a refusal to act. It is not a retreat from life. It is the end of using force in the wrong way. It is the end of living like someone stationed at a gate, defending all day against imagined collapse. Many people think money is difficult because they have not worked hard enough. In truth, some of them have simply been too tense to recognize how often they themselves have locked the door they keep trying to open. This is Momentum Arc, a space for inner exploration and spiritual growth. Your likes, comments, subscriptions, and super thanks do more than support this work. They may become the turning point for another soul. In the middle of the 20th century, Alan Watts became one of the most important Western interpreters of Zen, Taoism, and Indian philosophy. He was not merely repeating Eastern ideas for a Western audience. He was translating them into a language modern people could actually live with. His work reached those who felt trapped inside ambition, fear, and inner conflict, and gave them a radically different way to understand the self. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts identified one of the deepest paradoxes of modern life. The more we chase security, the more insecure we become. Nowhere is that paradox more visible than in our relationship with money. What makes people so tense, he suggested, is not simply a lack of resources. It is the obsessive attempt to extract permanent guarantees from a world that is, by nature, fluid. This is the root of what is often called the law of reversed effort. Some things move farther away the more violently you pursue them. A person who falls into water and panics will often sink faster, precisely because of the panic. But if the body can stop fighting long enough to trust the buoyancy of the water, floating becomes possible. That is exactly how many people approach wealth. Their desire for money is fused with the fear of not surviving without it. They are afraid of illness without protection, afraid of a life without dignity, afraid of losing in the social game of comparison. So every decision about money, every investment, every risk, every delay, gets processed through an overactivated fight or flight system. And what happens in that state? Vision narrows, patience weakens, sensitivity to subtle signals disappears. The ability to wait for what matters is replaced by the need to control what cannot be controlled. Even good judgment becomes difficult when the body is permanently braced for danger. That is why chronic tension does not attract wealth. It often drives away the very openings that might have changed a life. If you stop for a moment and notice your breathing while you are thinking intensely about money, it may already tell the story. For many people, that breath is shallow, quick, almost suspended. And the thing blocking abundance is not always the market. Often it is that familiar state of internal constriction they no longer even notice. Many people cannot relax because they have moved their lives into an imagined future. They keep telling themselves, once I make enough, then I will rest. Once this deal is done, then I will enjoy life. Once I cross this line, then I can breathe. On the surface, that sounds mature, responsible even. But over time, it quietly changes the architecture of a life. The body is still here, in the present. The mind has already emigrated into tomorrow. Watts warned that if a person cannot live now, that person cannot truly live at any time. Because when the future arrives, it no longer appears as the future. It arrives as the present. And if the present has been ignored all along, then even fulfillment will be met by the same postponement reflex that shaped the rest of life. This is how people end up delaying everything that gives life texture. Rest is delayed. Pleasure is delayed. Satisfaction is delayed. Connection is delayed. And with that delay comes a quiet erosion of sensitivity. A meal carefully prepared is eaten in haste. A child's presence is barely registered. Conversations become information exchange. Even sitting still begins to trigger guilt, as though every unproductive moment has to defend its existence. From the outside, this can look like drive. In reality, it often weakens a person. When attention is chained to the future for too long, present opportunities become harder to see. Some of the most decisive turns in life begin as small, easily missed moments. But once money becomes the sole imagined exit from incompleteness, everything starts to revolve around getting there faster. Relaxation begins when you stop giving the future absolute authority. It means admitting that this moment is already real enough to stand on. Not perfect, not complete in the way the mind demands, but whole enough that your inner life no longer has to be organized around what is missing. The moment that happens, a different kind of stability begins to appear. You are no longer running to prove your worth, and no longer forcing yourself to chase goals as though they were emergency exits. And once you stop placing your sense of safety entirely in the hands of the future, another question rises on its own. If the future cannot be controlled, what does it mean to live well with uncertainty? The moment you begin accepting the completeness of the present, you also begin facing a deeper fact. The world has never been stable in the way we want it to be. Life contains uncertainty from the start. Plans change, structures loosen, weather turns. What looked solid begins to move. Most people remain tense for years because they are still trying to eliminate that uncertainty entirely. They want a job that can never shift, an investment that never trembles, a life path with every turn labeled in advance. But as Watts saw so clearly, the demand for certainty is itself a major source of inner unrest. We often imagine that anxiety comes from how much the world changes, but some of the deepest anxiety comes from how stubbornly the mind tries to freeze change in place. The problem is that life is not a still photograph. It is more like weather, clear one moment, fogged the next, wind moving through, then sudden rain. If someone demands permanent sunshine from the sky, every passing shadow becomes a crisis. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts suggests that real security does not come from control, but from allowing movement. The moment we stop requiring the world to guarantee us absolute safety, a deeper steadiness becomes possible. That steadiness is not built on knowing exactly what will happen. It is built on the ability to remain unpanicked when what happens cannot be predicted. That capacity often reveals itself not in clarity, but in fog. The road is still there, but you cannot see very far. The direction has not vanished, but it no longer offers itself in a clean, pre-packaged line. Most people, in moments like that, rush harder. They reach for quick answers. They make rushed decisions simply to feel temporary relief. But some people do something different. They pause in the fog. They do not hurry to name the unknown. They do not force an interpretation onto the future before it has had time to reveal itself. They let the eyes adjust. They let the path return at its own pace. That is often where real turning points begin. Not after certainty has arrived, but before it does. Once a person stops demanding guarantees, subtler signals become audible. Possibility does not emerge from control. It emerges from permission. Some roads can only be walked by people willing to move before the entire map is visible. Many people have turned life into something to be solved. From early on, they were taught to find the right answer, choose the right path, avoid mistakes, plan carefully, and secure the future. Over time, existence stops feeling like life and starts feeling like a test that never ends. One problem is solved, and another appears. One threshold is crossed, and another anxiety waits beyond it. That is how people become constant problem solvers. Income must rise. Relationships must be maintained. Risk must be managed. The future must be prepared for in advance. As if enough vigilance and intelligence could finally smooth life into a perfectly controlled line. Watts saw the exhaustion hidden inside that habit. The deeper source of fatigue is often not life itself, but the urge to treat life as something that must be fixed before it can be lived. That is why his insight matters. Life is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be lived. We keep assuming everything must be arranged correctly before life can truly begin. But the more urgently we try to settle life in advance, the more of life itself we miss. Watts once compared life to music. No one listens to a symphony only for its final note. If the ending were all that mattered, the melody, the pauses, and the resonance between tones would lose their meaning. Yet many people live by a colder system. By this age I should have achieved this. By this stage I should own that. By now I should be safely on track. An invisible examiner takes up residence in the mind, measuring life against a private checklist. Then a person is no longer living, but comparing. No longer experiencing, but auditing. But life is not a sequence of gates to be cleared. It is a path unfolding beneath the step you are already taking. Once that is truly felt, the world begins to change. Time regains texture. Process regains meaning. And a person begins to participate in life instead of merely trying to manage it. That is what it means to stop fighting existence and begin cooperating with it. And when that adversarial posture softens, flow is no longer an idea. It becomes something you can finally feel. If you strip money down beneath its numbers and symbols, you begin to see that wealth is never truly static. It is a movement. It resembles blood, which has to circulate to carry life. It resembles a river, which gathers force not by standing still, but by moving through rises, turns, and descent. People tend to assume that wealth comes from holding, storing, and accumulating. But often, the deeper question is not how much has been gripped, but whether flow is still alive in the system. Water that stops moving may look safe for a while, but over time, it loses freshness. A river is powerful because it keeps moving, keeps exchanging, keeps heading towards something wider than itself. Money works the same way. When it is treated only as a result to be preserved, it gradually loses vitality. When it returns to circulation, through value, creation, relationship, and exchange, it becomes generative again. So the real question is not only whether you have enough, it is whether the current has been interrupted. Many people are not truly lacking wealth as much as they have turned themselves into dams too early in life. On the surface, that can look safe. In reality, it blocks fresh movement from entering. This is why some people can possess substantial resources and still live like they are inside scarcity, while others, still on the way, are already experiencing growing levels of response and support. The difference is not always numerical. It often lies in whether a person has become stagnant water or a river still making its way forward. Once a river no longer moves, it is no longer really a river. It is only trapped water. Once wealth loses its movement, it no longer feels like a living force. It becomes something cold, guarded, and repeatedly checked, as if its only purpose were to soothe fear. Real transformation often begins not by pulling more things toward yourself, but by allowing what has gone still to move again. Once money is no longer used only to patch inner anxiety, it begins leaving behind that rigid defensive role and returns to circulation, value, and exchange. Then, it stops being just a number on paper and begins gathering into life in new and living ways. When a river continues far enough, it eventually arrives at something wider: the sea. The sea is vast not because it clutches every drop, but because it rests low enough to receive what flows into it, and calm enough to let things flow out again. The ocean does not become anxious about a future that has not arrived. It does not try to eliminate every wave, nor does it demand that the sky remain permanently clear. It allows storm and stillness alike, because that full permission is part of what makes it the sea. When a person truly begins to relax, the change is often quiet. You start noticing the warmth of the dinner light, the beauty in your family's laughter, the way a child's voice is not just noise, but trust. Moments once rushed past begin to sharpen and soften at the same time. And in that shift, life is no longer a problem to solve. The fantasy of the future loses some of its grip. What remains alive is what is here. When you stop struggling like a panicked swimmer, you can finally feel the buoyancy of life itself holding you up. In that state, money is no longer a shield against fear, and no longer a number meant to plug the hole of inner unease. It becomes one more note inside the larger music of being alive. You no longer need to turn yourself into someone who lives in chronic defense. You become calmer, more spacious, more like the sea, neither resisting waves nor depending on stillness. And little by little, the things that matter begin returning. Relationships grow softer. Time feels wider. Opportunities begin appearing in ways that no longer seem forced. So relax. Allow uncertainty. Admit the fullness of this moment. Let yourself see that the present is already substantial enough to stand in. The less you insist on permanent safety, the less you strain in the wrong way, the more inner scarcity begins to dissolve. And when that happens, wealth and the deeper abundance of life begin moving toward you the way rivers move toward the sea. Quietly, inevitably, and with more force than panic could ever create.